In the midst of a crucial business dinner, Edward Hale's attention was diverted by a tiny voice. "Excuse me, sir." He turned to see a little girl, her bright blue eyes gazing up at him. With a moment's hesitation, she lifted her small wrist, revealing a birthmark, the very same as his own. "My mom told me," she whispered, "if I ever found someone with this, he might be my dad." In that instant, the world around Edward dissolved. His past had not only found him, but was looking back with his own eyes. Edward Hale was dining in one of the city's most exclusive establishments, a haven of guaranteed privacy and flawless service. The evening was unfolding predictably. Another business dinner, another deal being forged, another night where events transpired exactly as orchestrated. He found himself not entirely engaged in the table's conversation. His associates discussed market expansions and potential takeovers, but Edward's thoughts drifted. His empire was built on a foundation of discipline and strategy, yet a peculiar emptiness had begun to surface lately, one he couldn't quite articulate. He brushed it off as mere fatigue, swirling the wine in his glass and releasing a slow breath. His keen blue eyes surveyed the dimly lit restaurant. The space teemed with the city's upper crust, politicians, celebrities, and fellow executives. Everything about the environment was customary, almost routine, until a small voice pierced the ambient murmur of conversations. "Excuse me, sir." Edward turned, taken aback. Standing beside his table was a young girl, perhaps no more than 8 years old. Her long, wavy blonde hair framed a delicate face, and her remarkably bright blue eyes held an unsettling familiarity. She clutched a napkin, twisting it nervously in her small hands. Edward frowned. While it wasn't uncommon for affluent families to dine with their children in such establishments, something about this child felt out of place. She appeared to be alone. He scanned the room, anticipating the sight of an anxious parent hurrying to her side, but no one approached. "Are you lost?" he inquired, his tone level yet tinged with curiosity. She paused before shaking her head. "No." "Where are your parents?" Another pause, and then slowly she extended a small hand towards him. It was then he noticed it, a birthmark, not just any birthmark, but his birthmark, the same unique shape in the exact same location on her wrist as the one on his own arm. His breath hitched. The restaurant, the surrounding voices, all seemed to recede and blur. The little girl's blue eyes were fixed on his, searching, expectant. Then she spoke once more, her voice quiet yet steady. "My mom told me that if I ever encountered someone with the same birthmark as me, I should tell him." Edward's grip on his wine glass intensified, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Tell him what?" he asked, his voice now softer. She swallowed, then murmured the words that fractured his meticulously constructed reality. "That you might be my dad." Edward stared at the girl, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wine glass as his mind reeled to comprehend her words. The statement felt unreal, utterly impossible. His daughter. No, it had to be some sort of mistake. He scrutinized her face, searching for a resemblance beyond the birthmark, her blonde hair, those vivid blue eyes. There was an undeniable echo of himself in her features that he couldn't dismiss. The bustling restaurant around him faded to a distant hum. The men at his table had fallen silent, sensing the unusual turn of events, but Edward paid them no mind. His entire being was focused on the little girl standing before him, awaiting his reaction. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower this time, more measured. The girl hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She glanced down at the napkin in her hands, as if drawing courage from it. "My mom told me that if I ever saw someone with this birthmark," she said, lifting her small wrist once more, "I should tell him because it might mean he's my dad." Edward took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. Only one person could have imparted that information. "Who is your mother?" he asked, though a chilling certainty was already dawning. The girl's lips pressed together briefly before she answered, "Lillian Brooks." The name struck him like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it in years, yet it was a name etched permanently in his memory. Lillian had been significant once, someone who had loved him despite his imperfections. But he had walked away, convinced that love and family would only impede his ambitions. He had chosen his career, and now, standing before him, was the living consequence of that decision. Edward pushed his chair back and rose, towering over the small child. His heart pounded, but his expression remained inscrutable. "Where is your mother now?" The girl lowered her gaze, her small fingers tightening their grip on the napkin. She died last month." A tightness constricted Edward's chest. Lillian was gone. He hadn't seen her for years, hadn't allowed himself to think of her in just as long, and now the chance was gone forever. The finality of it struck him with an unexpected force. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. He couldn't lose his composure, not here, not now. His attention returned to the girl, his daughter. "What's your name?" he asked. She lifted her gaze, her bright blue eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. "Emily," she said softly. The name resonated in his mind, both foreign and achingly familiar. Edward glanced around the restaurant. Patrons were beginning to take notice of the unfolding scene. He had no desire to have this conversation under the prying eyes of strangers. He looked back at Emily. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. She hesitated for a fleeting moment, then nodded. Edward placed a hand on her small shoulder, guiding her towards the exit. His business dinner was unequivocally over. His entire existence had just been irrevocably altered. Edward led Emily from the restaurant, his mind still reeling. The valet, without a word, handed him his keys. He opened the passenger door of his sleek black car, gesturing for her to get in. She paused for only a second before climbing inside, clutching the seatbelt with small fingers, as if uncertain of its purpose. He settled into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly before glancing her way. She looked so diminutive in the large leather seat, her blue eyes darting between him and the unfamiliar opulent interior. "Where have you been staying?" he asked, pulling out into the street. Emily shifted in her seat. "With Miss Corinne, she's our neighbor. She took me in after." Her voice trailed off, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress. "But she said I can't stay forever." Edward exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip on the wheel tightening. The thought that his daughter, his child, had been left in a neighbor's care after her mother's passing caused a profound twist deep within him. Lillian should have told him. He should have known. He forced his voice to remain even. "And before that, did your mother ever mention me?" Emily hesitated. "She told me you were important, that you were busy." She paused. "She said you had your own life." Edward clenched his jaw. He could almost hear Lillian saying those words, softening the harsh truth so Emily wouldn't grow up resenting a father she'd never known. She should have told him. He swallowed the frustration welling in his chest. "Did she ever say why she didn't tell me about you?" Emily shook her head. "No, she just said you weren't ready back then." The words struck him harder than he anticipated. He wanted to argue to deny it, but a deep-seated honesty acknowledged their truth. 8 years ago, he wouldn't have had the first clue how to handle a child. He'd barely known how to manage himself, too engrossed in his career to consider anything or anyone else. But now, sitting in the car with his daughter, everything felt different. He glanced at her again. "Do you have anything with you? Clothes, toys?" Emily shook her head. "Miss Corinne packed a small bag, but I left it there. I didn't know if you'd want me to come with you." Her voice was quiet, uncertain, and something in her tone made Edward's stomach clench. "Of course I want you with me," he said, more firmly than he'd intended. Emily's head turned towards him, her blue eyes wide with an unreadable expression. He cleared his throat, trying to dislodge the unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. "We'll go pick up your things tomorrow. Tonight, you'll stay with me." She nodded but remained silent. The rest of the drive passed without conversation, though it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Emily watched the city lights stream past her window, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. When they pulled up to his residence, a sleek modern mansion nestled in the tranquil outskirts of the city, Emily's mouth fell slightly open. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward glanced at the large house, its perfectly manicured lawns and towering windows reflecting the soft glow of streetlights. He'd never really considered it before, but yes, it was vast, cold, designed for a man who had never anticipated sharing his space. "Yes," he said simply. Emily stared for another moment before nodding. She offered no comment on whether she liked it. He exited the car, walking around to open her door. She climbed out slowly, her gaze still flicking between him and the imposing structure. "Come on," he said, placing a hand lightly on her back as he guided her toward the front entrance. As they stepped inside, the profound quiet of the house enveloped them. The high ceilings and expansive open spaces that usually felt normal to him suddenly seemed cavernous and empty. Emily took small, hesitant steps, looking around carefully as if she couldn't quite believe she was meant to be there. "This place is huge," she said finally. Edward let out a short breath. "I suppose it is." She turned to look at him. "Do you live here alone?" He hesitated before nodding. "Yes." Emily studied him for a long moment before her gaze drifted around the room again. "It feels kind of quiet." Edward wasn't sure why, but her observation settled in his chest in a way that made him uneasy. He gestured towards the grand staircase. "Come on, I'll show you your room." Emily followed him up the stairs, her small footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. He led her to a guest room, one of several, though he'd never actually had occasion to use them. The room was pristine, the bed impeccably made, the decor minimalist. It was functional, yet devoid of personality. Emily stood in the doorway, looking around. "It's nice," she said, though her voice lacked any real emotion. Edward suddenly realized how utterly unprepared he was for this. The room was just a space. There were no toys, no stuffed animals, no warmth, nothing that made it hers. "We'll get you things tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to her. Emily nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Edward turned to her. "Of course." She looked up at him, her blue eyes serious. "Are you going to keep me?" His stomach clenched. "Keep you?" he repeated, thrown by her phrasing. Emily shifted her weight. "Miss Karen said she wasn't sure where I would end up. She said, you might not want me because you didn't know about me before." Edward inhaled sharply, pushing back the sudden surge of emotion that struck him. "I didn't know about you before," he said carefully. "But now that I do," he crouched slightly, bringing himself to her eye level. "You're not going anywhere, Emily." Her fingers tightened slightly around the hem of her dress. "Promise." He held her gaze. "I promise." For the first time since they had left the restaurant, Emily's posture seemed to relax just a fraction. She nodded, then let out a small breath. "Okay." Edward stood up, watching as she walked over to the bed and climbed under the covers. She looked tiny against the large expanse of the bed, but she didn't seem afraid. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he heard a small voice again. "Good night, Dad." Edward froze, his grip on the doorknob tightening. He had spent his life constructing a world where emotions were liabilities, where relationships were unnecessary encumbrances. But now, in a single night, everything had been upended. He turned his head slightly, his voice quieter than usual. "Good night, Emily." Then he switched off the light, closed the door, and for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. Edward barely slept that night. He had spent years maintaining absolute control over every facet of his life. His company, his reputation, his rigid routine. But now all of it felt insignificant compared to the reality that, in the adjacent room, his 8-year-old daughter was asleep in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house never intended for a child. He sat in his dimly lit office, staring out at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass reflected his own expression, calculating, tense, but beneath it, an unfamiliar emotion, doubt. He had no idea what he was doing. For years, he had convinced himself that emotions were weaknesses, attachments were distractions, and his work was all that truly mattered. But now, there was a little girl down the hall who had lost her mother, endured weeks of uncertainty, and asked him with heart-wrenching honesty, "Are you going to keep me?" Edward closed his eyes briefly, rubbing his temples. He hadn't even known she existed. He should have been furious with Lillian for never telling him, for robbing him of that choice. But what haunted him more was the thought of what Emily must have endured after losing her mother, waiting for someone to claim her, uncertain if anyone ever would. The notion of her feeling unwanted made something tighten in his chest. At some point in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally won, and he fell asleep in his chair. When he awoke, it was to the sound of faint movement outside his office door. Edward sat up, running a hand over his face before checking his watch. It was nearly 7. He had overslept, something he never did. He stood and stepped into the hallway, finding Emily standing near the staircase, peering over the railing. She turned when she heard him, her bright blue eyes widening slightly. "I didn't know where to go," she admitted, shifting her weight. "I didn't want to wake you up." Edward hesitated, still acclimating to the presence of another person in his home. "You can wake me if you need to," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Are you hungry?" he asked after a pause. She nodded again. Edward wasn't sure why he hadn't considered this earlier. He was accustomed to having his meals prepared by staff or eating at his office. But today was different. "Come on," he said, motioning towards the stairs. She followed him quietly as they made their way to the kitchen. The space was modern and sleek, with stainless steel appliances and marble countertops, more of a showroom than a place that had ever been truly lived in. Emily climbed onto one of the bar stools at the island, watching him. "Do you know how to cook?" Edward let out a short breath. "Not really." Her lips pressed together as if she was trying to suppress a smile. "Mom was really good at it." He paused at the fridge, glancing at her over his shoulder. "What did she make for breakfast?" Emily's fingers traced patterns on the counter. Pancakes mostly, she said. They were easy. Edward pulled open the fridge, scanning its contents. He found eggs, milk, and a box of pancake mix. He could manage this. He had closed billion-dollar deals. He could certainly handle pancakes. He placed the ingredients on the counter, turning to find Emily watching him with an air of mild skepticism. "What?" he asked. She shrugged. "You just don't seem like a pancake person." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What kind of person do I seem like?" Emily tilted her head, considering. "Like someone who drinks a lot of coffee and eats food from boxes." Edward smirked despite himself. "Not far off." He turned his attention to the mixing bowl, following the instructions as best he could. Emily rested her chin in her hands, clearly entertained by his culinary efforts. When he poured the batter into the pan, she leaned forward slightly. "Don't flip it too soon or it'll break." "Are you an expert?" She nodded solemnly. "I watched Mom do it a lot." Edward glanced at her. "Then you'll have to make sure I don't mess this up." Emily's blue eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. He didn't realize the significance of his words until he saw the slight shift in her expression, an almost imperceptible easing of tension. The first pancake turned out decently. The second was even better. He placed a plate in front of Emily and set down the syrup. She picked up her fork, took a bite, and chewed thoughtfully. "Well," he asked, crossing his arms. "They're not as good as Mom's." Edward let out a small laugh. "Figured." "But," she continued, taking another bite, "they're not bad." He took that as a victory. They ate in relative silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. For the first time since meeting her, Edward didn't feel completely out of his depth. When Emily finished, she set down her fork and looked at him seriously. "What happens now?" Edward exhaled, setting his coffee down. "Now we figure things out." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Are you sure you want to?" Edward held her gaze. "Yes." She seemed to consider that, then nodded slowly. "Okay." A single word, yet it carried immense weight. For the first time, she was allowing herself to believe that she might belong here, and Edward knew without a shadow of a doubt that he wasn't going to let her down. The morning after their initial breakfast together, Edward found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. His life had always been governed by order, efficiency, and control. But now, an 8-year-old girl resided in his house, a daughter he never knew existed, who had inverted his world in a matter of hours. Emily moved through the house with caution, as if uncertain she was truly permitted to be there. She didn't touch anything unless explicitly told she could. She didn't request anything. She was quiet, observant, watching him as if trying to ascertain if he genuinely meant it when he said she could stay. Edward was unsure how to handle this. He had spent his life negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, managing high-pressure situations, and making critical decisions under intense deadlines. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was profoundly real. By mid-morning, he realized another problem. Emily had no clothes, no personal belongings, nothing to make this house feel like hers. So, for the first time in years, Edward found himself walking into a department store. Emily stood beside him, her small fingers gripping the strap of her bag as she looked up at the towering shelves of clothes, shoes, and accessories. It was clearly overwhelming. "Pick whatever you like," Edward said, keeping his voice even. Emily hesitated. "Anything." "Yes." She bit her lip, looking around again. Edward could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she shifted on her feet as if she didn't quite believe him. "I don't need much," she finally said. "You need enough," Edward countered. "We're not leaving with just one outfit." Emily gave a small nod and started moving slowly down the aisle. She wasn't like most children he had observed in stores. There was no visible excitement, no darting from shelf to shelf, no impulsive grabbing of items. She was careful, thoughtful. She picked up a few things, examined them closely, then placed most of them back. Eventually, she settled on a couple of pairs of jeans, some shirts, a jacket, and a pair of sneakers. Edward frowned. "That's it." Emily nodded. He sighed. "We'll get more later." She looked up at him with an unreadable expression. "Why?" "Because you need things, Emily," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. "Okay." After checking out, they stopped at a bookstore. Emily walked through the aisles with much more confidence this time, her fingers running along the spines of books. Edward let her take her time, watching as she carefully chose 3. He raised an eyebrow when she handed them to him. "Only 3." She shrugged. "Books last a long time." Edward exhaled, shaking his head slightly. We'll come back when you finish these. Emily smiled, a genuine smile for the first time that day. Deal. The ride home was quiet but not strained. She sat in the passenger seat, flipping through one of her new books, occasionally glancing at him as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. When they arrived back at the house, she carried the shopping bags inside, setting them neatly by the staircase. You don't have to do that, Edward said. I have staff. I don't mind, Emily interrupted. She hesitated before speaking again. Mom always said you should take care of your own things. Edward wasn't sure why, but that statement struck him more deeply than he expected. He nodded. She was probably right. Emily gave him a small smile before grabbing her bags and heading upstairs to her room. Edward watched her go, exhaling slowly. He had never considered himself a father, never imagined he would have a child, never thought he would have to concern himself with things like school, books, or how many outfits an 8-year-old required. But now, standing in his own house, watching his daughter settle into a home that had never been intended for a child, he realized something profound. This wasn't just about allowing her to stay. This was about ensuring she never felt like she didn't belong. And for the first time in his life, Edward Hale understood that some things were more important than business. Family was one of them. That evening, the house felt different. It was a subtle shift, a change in the atmosphere and the way the silence wasn't quite as heavy. Edward wasn't accustomed to this sensation. His home had always been precisely that, his. Every detail had been designed for efficiency, for comfort, but not for warmth. Now there was a child upstairs, a child who was his, and suddenly the walls seemed less imposing. He found himself in his office, attempting to catch up on work, but the numbers on the screen blurred together. His mind kept drifting to Emily. Was she settling in? Was she feeling out of place? Did she need anything? The fact that he didn't know was what unsettled him most. After a few minutes of trying and failing to focus, he pushed back his chair and stepped out into the hallway. He hesitated outside her door, unsure if he should knock or just retreat. Before he could decide, the door creaked open slightly. Emily stood there, looking up at him. She wasn't wearing the clothes she had picked out earlier, just a slightly oversized t-shirt that must have belonged to her mother. She held one of her new books in her hands, her fingers lightly gripping its edges. Hi, she said. Edward cleared his throat. Hi. She shifted on her feet. I was going to read for a bit before bed. He nodded. That's good. She hesitated. Mom used to read to me sometimes. The words hung in the air between them. Edward felt their weight, the unspoken question beneath them. I could read to you, he found himself saying before he had even fully processed the thought. Emily looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to offer. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. She walked back to her bed, climbing onto it and pulling the blankets over her legs. Edward followed, sitting in the chair beside her bed. She handed him the book, her blue eyes watching carefully as he opened it. He glanced at the title. It was a children's book, but one with a deeper message, something about courage and finding your way home. He started reading, his voice steady, though he wasn't sure if he was doing it correctly. Emily didn't interrupt, she just listened. By the time he reached the 3rd chapter, her eyelids had started to droop. She fought against it, struggling to stay awake, but eventually her breathing evened out and the book slipped from her hands. Edward sat there for a moment watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, but there was still a slight crease in her brow, as if she were afraid she might wake up and everything would be gone again. A knot formed in his chest. He quietly set the book on the nightstand, then stood up, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. Before leaving, he hesitated, then without thinking, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead. She didn't stir. He stepped back, glancing at her one last time before turning off the light and leaving the room. As he closed the door behind him, a realization settled over him. This wasn't just about giving her a place to stay. She needed a home, a family. And for the first time, Edward knew he wasn't just taking care of a child. He was her father. The next morning, Edward woke up earlier than usual. His internal clock was trained for efficiency, for early mornings and late nights dedicated to work. But today, something felt different. He wasn't rushing to check his emails or preparing for a conference call. Instead, his mind went straight to the small girl sleeping in the next room, his daughter. The words still felt foreign to him, but less so than the day before. He stepped out of his bedroom, pausing at Emily's door. It was slightly ajar, and he could hear soft shuffling from inside. He knocked lightly. "Come in," Emily's small voice called. Edward pushed the door open and found her sitting on the floor, carefully folding the new clothes they had bought yesterday. She was organizing them into neat piles on the bed. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I have someone who can take care of laundry." Emily shrugged. "I don't mind." She smoothed a wrinkle from a shirt, her small fingers working carefully, as if the simple task gave her a sense of control. Edward leaned against the doorway. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded. "Yeah," she hesitated. "Thanks for reading to me." Something in his chest tightened at the quiet sincerity in her voice. "You're welcome," he said. "I can do it again tonight if you want." Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes widening slightly, as if she hadn't expected the offer. Then she gave a small nod. "Okay." Edward watched her for a moment longer before clearing his throat. "You should eat something before we go." Emily tilted her head. "Go where?" Edward hadn't told her yet. He hadn't been sure how she would react, but after last night, he knew what he had to do. "We're going to pick up the rest of your things from Miss Coren's." Emily blinked in surprise. "Oh," she paused, thinking for a moment. "Okay." There was no excitement, no relief, just quiet acceptance, like she had trained herself not to expect too much. That didn't sit right with him. "Get ready," he said. "We'll leave soon." Emily nodded and went back to folding her clothes. Edward turned and walked downstairs, making a mental note to remind himself of something important. This wasn't just about bringing her things home. This was about making sure she knew it was her home, too. The drive to Miss Coren's house was quiet. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly tapping against each other. Edward glanced at her as they pulled up in front of a modest, two-story house. It was warm, inviting, the kind of place where a child should feel safe. Miss Coren was already waiting for them on the porch. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. The moment she saw Emily, her face softened. "There's my girl," she said warmly. Emily climbed out of the car, hesitating for just a second before walking up the steps. Miss Coren knelt down and wrapped her in a gentle hug. Edward watched from a few feet away, feeling like an outsider in a moment he had no right to interrupt. Miss Coren pulled back, brushing a strand of Emily's hair behind her ear. "Are you doing okay, sweetheart?" Emily nodded. "Yeah." She glanced back at Edward, then turned to Miss Coren again. "I think so." Miss Coren smiled, but then looked up at Edward, studying him for a long moment. "You must be her father." It wasn't a question. Edward met her gaze, nodding. "Yes." Miss Coren stood, folding her arms. "Lillian never told you, did she?" Edward clenched his jaw, shaking his head. "No." Miss Coren sighed. "I figured as much. She wanted to. She almost did so many times." She glanced at Emily. "But she was scared. She didn't think you'd want to be a father." Edward exhaled slowly, glancing at Emily. She was sitting on the porch steps now, hugging her knees to her chest, listening but not interrupting. "She should have told me anyway," he said quietly. Miss Coren nodded. "Yes, she should have." Silence stretched between them before she spoke again. "Emily's been through a lot. She lost her mother, she lost her home. She's been trying to be strong, but she's just a little girl." She paused. "She needs you, Mr. Hale, more than you probably realize." Edward's chest tightened at the weight of those words. "I know," he admitted. Miss Coren studied him again, then gave a small nod as if deciding something. "Her things are inside. I packed everything she left here." Emily stood up. "I can get it." Edward stepped forward. "We'll both get it." Emily blinked in surprise but didn't argue. Inside, the house smelled like warm spices, the kind of place where memories lingered in every corner. Edward noticed framed pictures on the walls, some of Miss Coren's family, but a few of Emily as well. She had been loved here. They carried out the small bag of belongings, which wasn't much. Some clothes, a few stuffed animals, a framed photo of her mother. When everything was packed into the car, Miss Coren crouched down in front of Emily again. "You have my number, sweetheart. You can call me anytime, okay?" Emily nodded, her expression calm, but Edward saw the way her hands clenched slightly. She was holding back emotions, much like he often did. Miss Coren smiled gently. "You take care of yourself." Emily swallowed, then wrapped her arms around Miss Coren in a quick but tight hug. Edward looked away, giving them a moment. When Emily finally climbed into the car, she let out a small breath, staring out the window. The drive back was even quieter than before. Edward wasn't sure if he should say something, but after a while, Emily spoke first. "She took good care of me," she said softly. Edward nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "I can tell." More silence, then after a long pause, Emily turned to him. Are you going to take good care of me too? Edward felt that question like a punch to the chest. He glanced at her, at the way she was trying to sound casual but couldn't quite hide the uncertainty in her voice. Yes, he said, no hesitation in his voice. I will. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. She didn't say anything else, but this time she seemed just a little more relaxed. And for the first time, Edward realized maybe she was starting to believe it. That night, Edward found himself doing something he had never done before, walking past his office without stopping. His laptop sat untouched on his desk, his inbox overflowing with emails, yet none of it felt urgent. Instead, his focus was elsewhere. Emily was in her room, unpacking the small bag of belongings she had brought from Miss Coren's. She had been quiet since they got back, but not in the way she had been before. This wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of someone trying to make sense of a new reality. Edward hesitated outside her door before knocking lightly. "Come in," Emily said. He stepped inside, glancing around. The guest room still didn't feel like a child's space. It was too polished, too impersonal. But Emily had carefully placed her stuffed animals on the bed and set the framed photo of her mother on the nightstand. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. "You settling in?" Edward asked. Emily shrugged, "I guess." He leaned against the door frame. "I was thinking maybe tomorrow we could get some things for your room, make it more yours." Emily looked up, her blue eyes filled with something hesitant. "Like what?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Whatever you want, a desk, new bedding, maybe some posters." Emily chewed her lip. "I've never had my own room before." Edward frowned. "You shared with your mom." She nodded. It was small, but it was nice. He glanced around again at the cold, spacious room that had been designed for guests who never stayed. "Well, this one is yours now, so you should make it feel that way." Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." Edward exhaled. "Good." She hesitated. "Can we get paint?" He raised an eyebrow. "You want to paint the walls?" She nodded. "Mom let me pick the color in our old place." Edward had never given a second thought to the color of his walls. They were neutral, understated, carefully chosen by an interior designer. But now, for the first time, he realized that his preferences didn't matter. "What color?" he asked. Emily tilted her head, thinking. "Blue." Edward smirked slightly. "Figures." Emily's lips twitched, like she was holding back a smile. They stood there for a moment in silence before she spoke again. "Are you still going to read to me tonight?" Edward blinked. He had offered once, but he hadn't expected it to become a habit. Yet now, as he looked at her, waiting for his answer, he realized he didn't mind. "Yes," he said. "Pick a book." Emily nodded and reached for the one she had been holding earlier, climbing onto her bed. Edward took the chair beside her, flipping to the page she had marked. He read, his voice steady, and as the words filled the room, Emily's posture softened. By the time he reached the second chapter, she had begun to blink slower, her breathing evening out. Edward closed the book but didn't move right away. He watched her sleep, the way her small hands rested against the blanket, the way the framed photo of her mother sat beside her like a quiet reassurance. For so long he had thought his life was full, his success, his power, his carefully controlled world. It had been enough. But now, sitting here watching his daughter sleep, he realized something else. His life hadn't been full at all. It had been waiting to be, and finally it was. This story isn't merely about a millionaire discovering he has a daughter. It's about redemption, responsibility, and the unforeseen ways life compels us to confront our past. Edward Hale begins as a man convinced he possesses everything: power, wealth, and dominion over his world. In reality, he is isolated, his life meticulously structured to evade emotional connections. When Emily appears, everything he believed he knew about himself starts to unravel. What makes this narrative potent is not just Edward's realization of his paternity, but his gradual metamorphosis into a father. He doesn't transform overnight. There are doubts, missteps, and moments of indecision. Yet with each passing day, he chooses Emily, not from a sense of duty, but because he genuinely wants to. Emily, on the other hand, is a child who has endured immense loss. She is cautious, reluctant to believe that Edward will remain. She doesn't ask for much, but her quiet hope is what fuels the story's emotional depth. She doesn't require a perfect father. She simply needs someone who won't abandon her. The beauty of the ending lies in its simplicity. Edward reading to her at night, helping her select items for her room, promising her that she is home. These small gestures demonstrate that love isn't about grand pronouncements, but about consistency, about being present. Ultimately, this is a tale of second chances, illustrating how life sometimes presents you with something entirely unexpected, which turns out to be precisely what you were missing. Edward didn't just find his daughter, he found the absent piece of his own existence. And for the first time, he truly comprehended what it means to be rich.